Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the membership body for academics, artists and advocates interested in animal issues. ASA has their conference coming up in July in Adelaide. I'll be there. Many animal studies scholars will be there and you should be there too. So get yourself to the ASA conference in July and also become a member. ASA can only do its job when it has membership subs coming in. So please think about joining ASA. ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, well, once again, we have a very special guest this episode. We are coming to you from a very humid Sydney town, and I'm very thrilled to be joined by one of my mentors and one of my very wonderful former colleagues from the University of Melbourne. So this episode, we're joined by Professor Barbara Creed. Until recently, Barb was Professor of Film Studies at the University of Melbourne. Barb will be very well known to many of our listeners. Some of you will know her via her animal studies work. Others will know her from her very famous film study text, which I've got a funny feeling I'm going to mispronounce, but that's tradition on this show, the Monstrous-Feminie. More recently, though, Barb has turned her attention to animal studies, and today we're going to discuss her brand new book, which is called Stray, Human-Animal Ethics in the Anthropocene. Stray is published by Power Polemics, and I caught up with Barb just before she was about to launch the book in Sydney town. So welcome to the podcast, Barb.
Thank you, Siobhan.
So, Barb, can you start by telling us what led you to write this book?
Well, it's a very complex question because many things. As you know, we had met up at Melbourne Uni, and through getting to know you and all your work with knowing animals, I found all this very inspiring just at the time when I was also turning my attention to human-animal studies. I think the reason I wrote this book, Stray, was that I wanted to look at a concept that brought human and animal together. As you know, at the time at Melbourne University around 2011, we set up the Human Rights and Animal Ethics Research Network because I have a strong belief that it is really important to think about animal issues in relation to all species, human and animal. And the stray itself is a concept I've always been interested in. And as I thought more and more about it, I realised, of course, there are animal strays. And, of course, more and more, I think, we're in the Anthropocene, which is part of the book, we're now having to confront the possibility that we might all become strays, in a sense. I mean, stray, the idea of the stray is the outsider, the creature, human or animal, that's been expelled from the social group, in exile perhaps, but certainly on the fringes. I read Julia Kristeva discusses the stray a lot in Powers of Horror, and she makes the interesting point that all societies, the desire is to be settled, and she talks quite a bit about the stray, and she says, I stray in order to be. And I think what she means is that settled, civilised so-called societies need, in fact, strays, because how do we define ourselves as settled and civilised if we don't have the stray out there to remind us of what it might be if we were living on the outside? In the Anthropocene, in the book, I look particularly at refugees of climate change, animal refugees, and of course human refugees. And for example, in Australia, we've had some terrible incidents around refugees coming to Australia on the sea, And I noticed that many newspaper reports, or a number of newspaper reports anyway, began talking about the refugee boats as straying into Australian waters. And of course they weren't really. They'd set sail for Australian waters, but by denigrating refugees and aligning them with the idea of these are strays, this was one way of making them outsiders that we didn't want here, and in a sense linking them to the animal stray. So look, the human stray, the animal stray, both share a lot. The other interesting thing is, I think, that in the Anthropocene we've created what you might call, I look at animals that are bred in factory farms for human consumption. Now, if the stray, by definition, is a creature that is homeless and unloved, then it seems to me that all of these animals that we breed for our own consumption in conditions that are incredibly cruel, one couldn't say that they're living in homes, in a sense. They're living in between states. And I think that they're strays in a way, because they're cut off from their own kin, they're cut off from the historical lifestyles and memories and ways of relating of their own fellow creatures. They're in transition, so they're not certainly in a home, and they're certainly not loved or looked after in any sense of the word. So I think that we have created in the Anthropocene not only a vast number of human strays, but we have also, since industrialisation and particularly since the beginnings of the factory farms and the use of Fordist techniques to raise and breed and slaughter animals, we've created this new kind of anthropogenic stray. So I look at the way artists express or explore, novelists, photographers, filmmakers and so forth, the way in their works they've all looked at the concept of the stray, and many have, particularly the stray animal, and what these artworks and films and novels can teach us or tell us about the stray in human society, the human and animal stray. So I also suggest the idea of a stray ethics, because I think if we think of an ethics in terms of the most marginalised of all creatures, the stray, then we're always taking into account the lives of others that are completely marginalised, without, lacking a home, not cared for, not loved. That this kind of ethics, one, I think, brings people and animal together, because I've talked about how we have the stray as human and animal. So it's a kind of interspecies notion of ethics built around the figure of the stray, which is where I ended up after this incredibly long journey exploring the whole concept.
So, Barb, it strikes me that you have a great deal of empathy for the stray. Is this an idea that you've been playing with in one form or the other for quite a while, or do you have a tendency towards being drawn to the more marginalised members of the community or the others?
I think probably I do. I mean, I grew up gay, for example, and so at a time when the word lesbian was never used, going back to the 50s and 60s, and I suppose I felt marginalised, and to some extent always have. So perhaps from that point of view I have an empathy with the outsider, having felt in many ways an outsider. It's hard to know, really. I do remember as a kid, and I have no idea why, but we had a suburban backyard, and I created a farm in it, probably a bit like Noah's Ark, Barb's Ark, perhaps. You wouldn't believe, the animals I had there. I had rabbits and birds and bantams and guinea pigs and dogs and cats and a tortoise and a horse over the back fence, and I really identified. I certainly felt empathy with them all. They were my family in a way. I've often wondered why I did that. I was at primary school and my parents were pretty tolerant, so they let me collect more and more and more. But there must have been something there from the very beginning which drew me to the animal world.
So one of the things you discuss in your book is that our attitudes, the attitudes of humans towards animals, are riddled with contradictions. What do you mean by that?
Well, in terms of these sort of examples, on the one hand, we many of us, particularly who can afford to in the Western world, have pets. We have pet dogs in particular and pet cats, and we lavish incredible care and attention and devotion. I mean, our pets are part of the family, really. On the one hand, there's an incredible amount of love goes out to domestic pets, yet on the other hand, other animals, sheep, lambs, pigs, cattle, we treat with dreadful cruelty in factory farms. Yet those of us who've had a pet pig, to them this is incomprehensible because the pet pig is just as much a member of the family as the pet dog. It obviously has something to do with the fact that this whole process of factory farming and the slaughter of animals is kept separate from human the worlds that we inhabit, but that's an enormous contradiction. We we dedicate ourselves to campaigns to save the orangutan, for example. There are many programs we see on television about the perils of the orangutan, yet on the other hand, we use palm oil and so forth, which is one of the reasons that their forests are being decimated. We don't take the extra step really to try and get palm oil banned. So there are all kinds of ways. I mean, I remember when in Sydney Harbour, there was this little baby whale that everybody called Colin. It was actually a girl, but this is Australia after all. And Colin had attached herself to the hull of a boat in Sydney Harbour and was trying to suckle it. She thought this was her mother. She was a stray. She'd strayed into the harbour and she was abandoned, and there was such an outpouring of empathy for her that locals came and looked after her and would not let authorities near her, who of course they wanted to. But in the end, they euthanised her because she was starving. But they brought in an Aboriginal kind of whale whisperer who tried to comfort her, and it was an amazing outpouring of empathy and grief around this baby whale. Yet on the other hand, the dreadful things we do to animals facing extinction, for example, in Australia and some parts of Australia, even the koala bear. The way we hunt and kill kangaroos is appalling. So again, another contradiction. So some species are privileged and some are not.
So the book is called Stray, but the subtitle is Human Animal Ethics in the Anthropocene. Could you explain for our listeners what you mean by Anthropocene?
Anthropocene is a term scientists are using more and more. By this, they mean we are now living, they argue, in an age that we as humans have created. I mean, all other ages have evolved in a geological sense, but because of climate change and global warming, which we can now attribute directly to our own behaviours, we have created this age. So there's discussion about renaming it the Anthropocene, anthropos meaning man, just to make it clear that we have had enormous agency now on the direction of the planet. Now, some argue this began with agrarian societies in the Neolithic, when we first started changing the landscape of the planet and we first started hunting species and so forth. But others link it more to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and the world of factories and emissions and the invention of the car and so forth. We're all aware of the terrible ravages that climate change is having on the planet and the peoples and animals on it, through droughts and fires and extreme weather events. leading to wars, leading to fighting over resources, fighting over food, island peoples losing their whole homelands and so forth. So in the Anthropocene we see the creation of climate change refugees and climate change strays, human and animal. And I think this has happened to a large extent because the human has always seen itself as exceptional, superior to all other animals, and has never taken really the animal, well, certainly not in the modern period, the animal into account as a living other with a life and a destiny to live out, and with desires and needs and demands, and living in a social family, communicating with its kin and so forth. Animals have not been seen like this. So as a result, we have to our detriment objectified the earth and all its multi-species and exploited and abused them so shockingly that we are now heading ourselves into some kind of climate change end, maybe, pessimists argue. Others are more optimistic. They say, no, the human being is very inventive and we'll find a way out of this impending disaster. Others say it's too late. So this is another reason I've looked at the idea of the stray, because to stray is also a moral act. You can stray morally. I mean, there's the famous story of Little Red Riding Hood who strayed from the path and met the wolf, and after her exciting experiences, you'd have to call them in the end, she returned to the bosom of her family and promised never to stray from the path again. So it's interesting that it's a young girl who strays and creates this nursery rhyme that's designed to teach all children, particularly little girls, how to be proper young women. So I think the idea of the moral stray, I mean, one of the best studies or works I've read on that is Coetzee's Disgrace, because this is a book that deals with the human, the main character, as an ethical stray, and literally with actual strays, the stray dogs of the town, whom he in the end helps to put down, to euthanize. And he really in the end can't bridge the gap between himself and the wretched dogs. He tries, but he in the end I think fails. He still sees this separation between himself and the dogs. But it is a very moving and disturbing novel about the human as an ethical stray.
So, Barb, you use a lot of literary texts in Stray, and you use them to do the work of exploring the concept. More generally, what do you see as film and literary texts? What do you see as them contributing to the field of animal studies?
Oh, I think very important. I think the Anthropocene, interesting, is a concept, is a scientific concept, but it is being taken up very much in the social sciences and humanities now. And we find conferences and special issues of journals coming out of film studies, media studies, literary studies, art history studies, queer studies. I noticed a conference a year or so back in London on queer animalities, for example. So the concept has had a big impact across the various disciplines within the universities. So I think it's very important that this whole area should be taught in the humanities particularly, and sometimes it's a bit of a struggle to get subjects up because one's fellow lecturers and so forth don't see the importance of this field. I think it's crucially important, and so do many students. I'm finding more students want to write about this. They want to do their PhDs on it. They want to come to conferences because they're really engaged with what's happening now, really, in the planet. So artists, painters, filmmakers, novelists, poets, creative people in particular have also taken up this whole area and are writing about it and making artworks and installations globally, I find. It's a really vibrant, thriving area because it's so important.
Now, Barb, I couldn't help but notice that you dedicate the book to Nanette. Can you tell listeners who Nanette is or was and why she's important to you?
Nanette is an orangutan in the Paris Zoo. I believe she's still alive, and I saw this absolutely fantastic documentary about her by Nicolas Philibert, made in 2010. Look, she is the most fantastic creature. I love Nanette, I have to say. I just fell in love with her when I saw the documentary because she just comes across, her whole personality. It's just fantastic. But of course, she's been her entire life. She's been in the zoo. I think it's over 40 years now. And what Philibert does in the documentary is, it's a documentary not so much about Nanette. Well, it's about Nanette and everybody who comes to visit her. And she's such an identity that some people apparently visit her on their way home from work every day. They all know her, they know her name, they talk to her. And so on the soundtrack, you don't see the people who come to the zoo. You only hear what they say, and they all talk to her as if she's their psychoanalyst almost. And they talk to her about their marriages and how is she feeling, and is she as lonely as they are. And some say they understand how she feels because they're animals too. And it's very interesting how what Philibert's captured is the way people come to Nanette, seeing themselves as animals, just like Nanette. Of course, they're not. They're not in a large cage, having been cut off from their homeland their whole life. I see Nanette as a stray, really. She has a kind of home, but it's not a home of her own making. But she's on the fringes, as all animals in zoos are. And she herself, there's one sequence, when she gets sick of people looking at her, she just puts this towel over her head. They can't see her then. They talk about how she mimics things, and one day she sort of grabs one of the keeper's purse and pulls out the lipstick and puts it on and starts pouting with her lips at one of her companions, another orangutan, and then they pretend to kiss and so forth. So, look, Nanette is a highly intelligent being who has obviously got a sense of humour as well. The documentary, I'm not sure if it's available on YouTube, but it's brilliant.
Yeah. Wonderful.
So I dedicated the book to her because this was, I think, the first article I wrote on human-animal studies, and because the film is just so fantastic. Yeah, and Nanette is even better herself.
Well, that's a fantastic segue into the next part of the interview. So, Barb, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. You ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Okay, so you've answered this in part, but if you want to add anything, please do. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote? Oh, beg your pardon, you ever read?
That's difficult. Look, I'd have to say, and this is the book really that helped open my eyes to the whole area of human-animal studies, is Charles Darwin's The Expression of Emotions in Human and Animal, as well as his work on evolutionary theory. I mean, what is so brilliant about his approach is he is so against any idea of human exceptionalism. I mean, he dethrones the human subject. He sees the human animal as an animal linked with all other animals, having a common ancestor with the apes. And in a number of passages, he in fact talks about how, from his point of view, there are many animals who are much more ethical than people. So he is a realist, he's straight talking, there's just a wonderful wealth of scientific observation. The way he writes about, look, He writes fantastically about all animals from ants to apes. He observes them. And in the expression of the emotions, he argues that not only did human and ape evolve from a common ancestor, and not only are human animals part of the animal world, he also argues that our emotions evolved, and that the emotions we humans think we have alone, he argues, in fact, that all the species of animals he's so far studied have similar emotions. And he looks at the way human and animal, particularly the apes and dogs and cats, express their emotions through their body language, through facial expressions, through the way they open and close their mouth. They might snarl, they might appear to cry out or laugh. And he looks at the identical development of the way human and non-human express certain emotions by activating certain facial muscles in the same way. And very interestingly, when Robert Louis Stevenson wrote The Strange Tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he describes the evolution of man into ape in the same kind of language that Darwin uses to describe the expression of emotions of anger, so that in both man and animal, the lip curls back and the front teeth are bared and so forth. So he sees the expression of emotions as an evolutionary thing that human and animals share. So that, for me, really, I just thought that was fantastic, because he uses photographs, the first scientist I think to ever use photography, and drawings to show how emotions are expressed. But once again, it was his attempt to argue that the human is not exceptional.
Wonderful. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, as mentioned, my favourite, and I think it was the first, is the article on Nanette, which I discussed a minute ago.
Yeah, wonderful. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I really can't name one.
A lot of people try to fudge that question.
Well, I bet they do. It's all too complex. Well, look, I'm a film scholar, so the first and most important book I read on animals in relation to film was Annette Pick's Creaturely Poetics, which is a wonderful book which looks at the representation of animals in literature and in film, in which Pick argues for the importance of obligations, really. We have an obligation to treat ourselves and all other human animals with the same care and the same and to give them the same rights and justice. It's an obligation. It's not a matter of who's more deserving. And she presents her argument very eloquently, and that certainly made a big impression on me. Kelly Oliver's Animal Lessons is fantastic, and here she very carefully and critically explores the writings of almost all the major philosophers in the Western canon, and looks at even those who have presented pro-animal arguments. Nonetheless, she looks at the way virtually all of them nonetheless express a kind of anthropocentric point of view. That is, no matter what they might say about how they respect animals and that animals have rights, etc., there are always those moments when the human is posited nonetheless as different and superior. So she's quite clear-eyed and rational and strong about her point of view. So I found that had a very big impact too. And Kerry Wolf's Animal Rights, his whole argument, his whole critique of humanism, I think is wonderful too.
Fantastic. And of course, Annette Peake is a friend of the show, and she's already been on previously. So, Barb, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think the most important thing now is to try and design new subjects on human-animal studies, and having tried myself, it's not necessarily that easy. The universities are not all interested. Not all of them are interested in this new field. Many are, thank goodness. I think we need courses. We need to. The many students are interested, however, so we need to publish. We need to encourage students' research, to set up reading groups for students. As Siobhan well knows, she has an amazingly successful reading group, and to be happy and willing to supervise their theses, and yes, to create this, to help create the field, really, because here in Australia it's still in its infancy, whereas in many universities, from what I gather in America and Europe and the UK, it's not. It's already an established discipline.
So, Barb, if you could change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, it'd be great if we could change places for a while.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Yes. The power balance. I mean, the crucial importance of the human animal taking on board an interspecies ethics where the human sees, relates to, exists with, supports non-human animals as it does itself and its own kin.
Wonderful. So, Barb, what are you working on next?
Well, various things. The one that springs to mind first is that my partner, Professor Nanette Horn from Melbourne University, and I are planning to create a new course for Coursera, a new MOOC, one of these massive online courses on the internet. Jeanette's already created a wonderful course called Sexing the Canvas on art and sexuality, which has been amazingly successful. So our next project we'd like to do together on animals, empathy and art.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that sounds wonderful. So where can people find out more about your work?
On my website at the University of Melbourne, and also on the other website that's there for Hooray, the Human Rights and Animal Ethics website. If you put that into Google, it'll come up, and there we have a list of the recent writings and achievements of members of Hooray, and anyone interested should read the website. There's a lot of interesting work going on that's noted up there. And as you know, you were a founding member.
And people who are in Melbourne or who can get to Melbourne easily should be aware that there's a reading group that meets once a month at the University of Melbourne, and if you contact Barb or just Google that up, you'll find all the information you need to get involved. So, Barb, thank you so much for coming on Knowing Animals.
Well, thank you, Siobhan, and I think it's fantastic that you've got this running, this podcast.
Thank you.
It's really important.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And don't forget to review us on iTunes. That's all for now. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals.